Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of Dr. Pramod Jaiswal, Research Director, NIICE, I welcome you all to the first session of our discussion series on the US election, brought to you by the Nepal Institute of International Cooperation and Engagement. I extend a warm welcome to our esteemed chair for the session, Ambassador Vishnu Prakash Sir, speakers, and the audience, of course. NIICE is an independent, apolitical, and non-partisan think tank whose belief lies in freedom, democracy, and a world free from conflict. We envision a world where sources of insecurity are identified and understood, conflicts are prevented, or resolved, and peace is advocated. And all these webinars are just a step forward to make this vision turn into a reality. Talking about today's session, our chair for the day is Ambassador Vishnu Prakash Sir, as mentioned before, and introducing him has always been a pleasure for me, and so is it this time. I would like to Ambassador Vishnu Prakash Sir to describe him. He has served as High Commissioner to Ottawa, Ambassador to Seoul, official spokesperson of Foreign Office, and Consul General to Shanghai. He has also done postings in Moscow, New York, Tokyo, Islamabad, etc. Since retirement in November 2016, he has turned into a foreign affairs analyst and commentator with a special focus on Indo-Pacific region. On behalf of NIICE, I welcome you, sir. We are obliged to have you today with us. And before I hand over the session to you, I'd like to put in notice of the audience that this session is streaming live on our Facebook channel. So please feel free to like, share, and comment. Furthermore, we as organizers expect you to mention your questions in the chat box for the speakers to answer during the other part of the session, in the question and answer session. With this, sir, now I hand over the session to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Aki. God bless. Dr. Walter Anderson, Dr. Kirk Dorsey, Professor Chang Chiatong, Dr. Asuka Matsumoto, Dr. David Mednikov, Dr. David Owen, Mr. Pramod Jaiswal, friends, ladies and gentlemen. It is such good evening. Namaste, Konbanwa, Wang Shanghao. I hope my pronunciation is okay. Delighted to welcome you all. This is the inaugural session of a new series called the Coffee House Debate that has been planned by NIICE. And one could not have hoped for a more distinguished panel of speakers or more important a subject than the forthcoming US presidential elections. I'm particularly happy that the moving force behind NIICE, Mr. Pramod Jaiswal, is with us today. Normally he welcomes me, but today let me have the pleasure of welcoming him to his own forum. You know, like most of the world, South Asia's attention is focused on the outcome of the American presidential elections. Given that USA is a preeminent power in the world and would remain so in the foreseeable future, geopolitics and geoeconomics is impacted by the White House occupant. There's another side to it. As per Winston Churchill, he is supposed to have remarked, you can always quote, you can always count on the Americans to do the right thing after they have tried everything else, unquote. And indeed, we have the current colorful occupant in Washington of the White House, who is trying many things, though not everything. And the elections are happening at a crucial juncture when the world faces double whammy. The unprecedented crisis triggered by the corona pandemic and the rise of an expansionist power in Asia, which is determined to alter the status quo. Now, elections are just 3 weeks away, and the incumbent seems to be under pressure for especially having been taken ill when the campaign needed the most. That too by coronavirus, with which he believes, many believe, that the president took it lightly. Now, there are lots of questions I don't know how many answers are there, or there'll be multiple answers also. Will President Trump get the sympathy vote, or would his campaign be affected? His opponent, or once the youngest senator in the US, is now the oldest contestant at 77. President Trump evokes very strong emotions, but has had a favorable rating, I'm told, of never more than 49%, which is a very first in modern US history. Yet he has a solid following among the Republicans. So the related question is that, is the following amongst the Republicans continuing to be as solid as it was? I would be quite interested in your views whether the white Republican women voter are still supportive as they were, or that support has thinned a bit. Will Kamala Harris, who is an African Indian, be the first lady vice president in the US? Will the American president accept the election results in case it is narrow, the results are narrow, or will he manage to hold on to the crown? There are only 4 incumbent presidents since 1900 who could not make it to the second term. What are the issues that are critical to the average voter? And from the South Asian or the Indo-Pacific perspective, the big question always is whether the US will continue to look inwards, as many experts believe, or will there be a change in stance? I would also request my good friends from Japan and China, if possible, to speak about their expectations from the next president, from their country's perspective, and do they see continuity or change in the foreign policy priorities of in the US, and if possible, also to comment whether for their countries the Republican president or a Democratic president has been more responsive to their concerns and priorities. Well, we are very eager to your perspectives, and I have no intention of standing between you and the audience. We will try to make the session as interactive as possible. I sent you all a small request to limit the opening remarks to 8 minutes. I will time it. And in a gruff voice, when it is 7 minutes, I will say 7 minutes are over, so that you are suitably alerted. And then we will, if time permits, we are already running behind. We have about an hour 35 minutes as we speak. We will plan it suitably accordingly, either discussion amongst us or from the audience. Now, without further ado, may I request Dr. Anderson to kick off the discussions, and I'm going strictly by in the alphabetical order as per the surname. So I just wanted you to know he's an expert on the region. He's a senior adjunct professor of South Asia at the Johns Hopkins University. Walter, we are all ears.
Thank you. Appreciate being here, and I want to thank Pramod and yourself for organizing this in several meetings on the subject of the U.S. elections. In this initial session, I want to basically address 2 issues. One is something looking into the actual electoral process, because it's complicated, and I think unless you understand that, you may not understand, the way that the U.S. elections go, and certainly that was indicated in the last elections in the United States. And secondly, I want to briefly address, to the extent I have time, because I know we're going to get into this in the discussion, on the issues that seem to be uppermost in the minds of voters. A key question, of course, is who do we think will win the election? I personally think that the Democratic candidate, Joe Biden, is going to win. I say that with caution because in 2016, I also said Hillary Clinton was going to win on a similar panel to this one, in fact, 2 or 3 panels, where I sort of staked my reputation on the fact that she was going to win. The final popular vote in that election had her about between 2 and 3 percentage points in the popular vote ahead of Donald Trump, but Donald Trump won the Electoral College. And I think it's necessary to understand something about how the Electoral College operates, because that gave Trump the victory in 2016 and shapes, to a certain extent, the campaigning and issues in US elections. Now, Biden has had roughly the same lead in terms of popular vote over Trump that Hillary Clinton had during most of the campaign over Trump in 2016, anywhere between 6 and 10%. He's now, according to one group that I watch, Real Clear Politics, Biden is about 9 percentage points ahead of Trump. But presidential elections, as I mentioned, are not decided by a national popular vote. They're decided by an electoral college. And the representatives in the electoral college are voted from each state. Each state determines, a lot of things in terms of the election of the United States. The number of electors in each state are the number of representatives, and that tends to sort of, be determined by population. But there's one factor that throws it off considerably. Every state, in terms of electors, gets the same number of Senate seats, 2 Senate seats that each state has. So there are 538 electoral college votes for the 50 states, calculated by 435 House of Representatives and 100 senators, plus 3 from the District of Columbia. And any winner must have 270 seats to win in the US election. Now, not all states have laws saying that the electors must vote for the person decided by the state's popular vote. Some do, but many don't. And there has always been several who have voted a different way. But and in fact, in an election or two in the 19th century, it did have an impact on the ultimate result. I don't think it will this time, but that's something to keep in mind when thinking about elections, is that electors can actually break ranks with the party that voted them into power. Now, there's some further complexities in the electoral system with the Electoral College. And that is, the system tends to favor 2 parties rather than, and therefore regional parties and third parties have never really had much of a chance in the United States. And I think it has to do with the way that we elect presidents in the United States. Now, if neither of the 2 parties that are predominant in the elections can get a majority, it then goes to the House of Representatives, in which each state gets 1 vote. And that is determined by their representation in the House of Representatives. At the present time, that favors the Republicans. There are 26 states that have Republican majorities and 24 that have Democrat. In fact, Nancy Pelosi, the Democrat Speaker of the House, has told her Democratic colleagues that if the elections are close, and they could be, I don't think they will, but therefore we have to have, we have to take control of more seats. Now, this federal system was devised 2+ centuries ago to protect the interest of smaller states. Therefore, smaller states, and by extension, the Republicans have a certain advantage in the electoral system, since they tend to win more of the smaller states than do Democrats. For example, Democrats are almost certainly likely to carry the big states of California and New York by several million votes, as a matter of fact. But they are likely to lose many, if not most, of the states in the Midwest and the South to the Republicans in these states, have traditionally voted Republican. For example, a state with less than 1 million people or 1 million people has the same 2 senators as California and New York, despite the fact that there's a huge difference in population in those 2. And therefore, it's necessary for a Democratic candidate to get about 3 to 4% higher in the popular vote to stand much of a chance in winning if you sort of figure out how it distributes itself, in winning the Electoral College. The Democratic Party has, leaders in the Democratic Party have recently proposed dropping the Electoral College in favor of a national vote. I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon, because that requires a constitutional amendment. And in the US, constitutional amendments require 3/4 of states, that's 38 of the 50 states, back it. Small states are almost certainly not going to back a constitutional amendment that reduces their influence. So why were the predictions wrong? The press, the polls, largely undercounted the animosity of the white working class. That animosity, according to polls I've seen, still exists. It's an issue that the Democratic Party has to face, is why are they looked at as a party that sort of undermines the interests of the working class? This is interesting because the white working class had once been one of the main support bases of the Democratic Party. They no longer are. In fact, we may in fact be seeing a transition in support bases in US politics. Now, what makes this election so unusual, and in my view helps Biden? One is, of course, the coronavirus, which has a national impact. And until March of this year, the economy was doing relatively well. And Trump and the Republican Party were receiving benefits from the public as to, the improved status of the US economy. And they still do.
After 1 minute, this is your friendly neighbor.
Thank you. I'm wrapping up on issues. This is the one issue where Trump has consistently outpolled Biden, but the severity of the virus and President Trump's relatively slow response to it has worked against him in the public. And I think that is, as an issue, is a more important issue than the economy. Though both are important, I think that one's more important. Another issue is Trump's personality. He is a New York contractor with all the rough and tumble of that world, and he speaks that world, and that turns off a lot of people. And I think that's been one of the factors, particularly among suburban women that you mentioned in your introductory remarks. And secondly, I think, is the comparative lack of enthusiasm for either candidate. And that works to Biden's benefit, I think, because of the animosity, the greater animosity to Trump than to Biden. And I can think of my own neighborhood in Upper Washington, in Upper Virginia, across from Washington. I see almost no signs for either candidate, even though in the past there had been dozens of signs in my neighborhood about one candidate or the other. But the signs that do exist are largely Biden signs, and they refer to the issue of normalcy in the election. A third issue is, as I mentioned, is Trump's personality. And I think that personality is going to work against him. And there's more of a large number of never Trumpers, and former Secretary Colin Powell is one of them.
Sorry to be a pain in a certain part of the anatomy, but can I?
That's it. In fact, that's it. In terms of issues, there are some others. Immigration and foreign affairs, and my colleagues from China and you can note why the foreign affairs is such a relatively minor issue, which surprises me, and kind of undermines my chance to speak out in other forums where foreign policy is what I tend to focus on. So that's all I have to say.
Thank you very, very much. This has been an excellent presentation with perspectives which are very significant for us. And thank you for talking about the Electoral College. Having served in the US and been following elections, I'm puzzled by the role of the Electoral College. And later, you may wish to comment, and also the other panelists, whether hypothetically on the 4th of November, if the results are called or the election is called, and the difference is not very much, can the Electoral College, which meets much later, reverse the decision? That is something that we will love to hear. And you are a very brave man, sir, that you called the elections. So we will remember that, and we are sending out messages to all that who care to say that this is what Mr. Walter, Professor Walter has announced. Thank you. With this, can I invite Dr. Kirk Dorsey to take the floor? He is with the College of Liberal Arts at the University of New Hampshire, my favorite state in the US. I hope you are enjoying beautiful colors, and it is simply a stunning region to be in, and one would love to hear your perspective. on the elections. Go ahead, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. It's a pleasure to be here. And yes, I'm looking out the window at my office and the trees are changing colors. It's quite beautiful here. So we're very fortunate to be in New Hampshire. And New Hampshire also has a special place in American elections because the very first primary election takes place in New Hampshire, as it has for many decades. And so there's always a focus early in the campaign here in New Hampshire. I wanted to build on Walter's comments about the Electoral College and then look at a couple of the issues that you asked us to consider, Mr. Ambassador. One of the things I've noticed recently from political commenters is that the Trump campaign has bought ads in the Washington, D.C. television market. And there's some speculation, why would they do that? To come back to Walter's comments, the 3 electoral votes in Washington are definitely going to go Democratic. There's no chance that Trump is going to win any votes in the District of Columbia. And so part of what I want to talk about is the way in which the Electoral College shapes campaigns. So part of the reason there's probably not a lot of campaigning in Walter's neighborhood, but there's a fair amount of campaigning here in New Hampshire, is that New Hampshire is considered a swing state. It's a state where the electoral votes might be up for grabs. In the 2016 election, Hillary Clinton won New Hampshire by about 3,500 votes. There are a little more than 1 million people in the state, so it was a pretty close election here. And there was a time when the Trump campaign thought they had a chance to take New Hampshire's 4 electoral votes. It doesn't look like that's going to happen right now. But for instance, Massachusetts, right across the border, which is much larger, has very little presidential campaigning going on because it's clearly going to be a Democratic state. California, there's just not a lot because California is going to be Democratic. But some states are swing states, and I'd urge the people around the world who are following the campaign to look at states like the 3 surprise states from 2016, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, that Democrats thought they would win, but then they lost by very narrow margins. Those 3 states are all swing states. But one of the things that's really fascinating in this campaign is that more and more states are swing states. There's now talk that Florida and North Carolina, states that were oftentimes considered safe for Republicans, are really in play. And even Texas, which traditionally is thought of as a Republican bulwark, the Biden campaign thinks it has a chance to win Texas. The outcome of the Electoral College is really important to come back to the ambassador's question about what might happen on November 4th. If it looks like the Electoral College tally, which is going to take place on December 14th, is going to be very close, it certainly would give President Trump an opening to contest the election and say, I actually won. These 3 swing states that Biden is claiming because of fraudulent ballots, actually I won them. And then have a contest, a court case, for instance, maybe over Pennsylvania or Michigan, that could devolve into a really lengthy fight that might end up at the Supreme Court. Those of us who are old enough to remember the 2000 election, we saw that, a big fight over what happened in Florida and who got to count which ballots. And that determined who was the president. The Supreme Court got involved. So one of the things that's going on right now is the Biden campaign is trying really hard, I think, to expand its Electoral College reach, not just to focus on the safe states, but to try to win a few more of those swing states so that it can pile up, say, 300 or 320 electoral votes to really salt this away, so that even if there are a couple of states that are in question, the Biden campaign will win them. What's fascinating is the Trump campaign, which at one point had $1 billion in the bank, and it's going to be really interesting to find where that $1 billion went. Now does not have a lot of money, and they've had to pull back in some cases and retool their advertising and target particular swing states. And so to come back to the point I raised at the beginning, why then are they running advertisements in Washington, D.C., where they don't have a lot of money and they're not going to win Washington's electoral votes? I think this speaks to the state of mind of the candidate himself, that the campaign feels that it must show President Trump that they've got a strong message. And so the campaign is really focusing on one particular viewer in Washington, D.C., who we know watches a lot of television and a lot of the cable news networks. And so they're spending their money to convince him that they've got a good campaign. Now, in the long run, that may cause a problem for the nation if he loses, but says, but I was winning, look at all these campaigns, look at all these campaign ads, look how well I've been doing. That may encourage him to contest the election. I think that what's really striking about this election compared to 2016 is that President Trump does not appear committed to expanding the number of people who voted for him. If you look back at the last 3 Republicans who won office and then won a second term, Richard Nixon, Ronald Reagan, George W. Bush, all of them did better in terms of the popular vote in the second time than they did the first time. In fact, the first time, all three of them were pretty close. Reagan there was a third party candidate that drew some votes, but Reagan only had 51% of the votes in the 1980 election. All three of them successfully expanded their appeal so that they won more votes in the second time around and won the election fairly handily. George W. Bush was close, but it definitely was more of a victory than in 2000. Trump seems to have pursued a strategy of doubling down on his base and has very rarely attempted to expand his appeal. For instance, to come back to the ambassador's question about white suburban women, at one point in his presidency, Trump surprised everybody by saying, if you give me a clean gun control bill, I'll sign it. And his Republican allies almost all fainted. It could have been a brilliant strategy to appeal to people outside of his traditional base that he could govern broadly, but he pulled back from that. And that has really been the trend of Trump's governing. He makes these decisions that are unusual and then goes back to his base. And I think that's, to come back to Walter's point, that's why he's going to lose this election, because instead of expanding, he has shrunk, and the people who voted for him, many of them have decided they can't stand him anymore, and they will vote for Joe Biden. So I'll stop there to turn it over to the next speaker.
Wow, that's amazing. You have 2 minutes in your bank account, sir. I mean, that is amazing. You can encash that whenever you want to. So, but brilliant insights you have given us, especially the role of the swing states. And would you want to talk about a little more, since there is a bit of time, about why is it that the swing states are multiplying in the US? You did allude to that, but I guess if you could talk about that, that will be very useful. So, and also the war chest. I mean, $1 billion war chest shrinking is unusual. So what has led to the shrinkage, if you can?
Well, there's some indication that there was a lot of fraud. The last campaign manager was arrested recently, and it looks like he might have paid himself $40 million, which he clearly didn't earn. So, you know, 40 million is only a drop out of $1 billion, but they spent a lot of money early. That just appears to have been a very lavish spending campaign early. And it's not that they're bankrupt, but they don't have nearly as much money as the Biden campaign. In terms of the swing state, I'll just say quickly, it is, again, white suburban women in the United States who might have traditionally voted Republican, or in 2016 looked at Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump and they said, well, we know Hillary Clinton, we don't like her. We don't really know Donald Trump, let's give him a chance. Well, now they know Donald Trump. And a lot of them have said, no, I'm not making that mistake again. And so, for instance, my home state of Ohio, which is has been traditionally very Republican, is swinging into the swing state column. And again, it's the suburban women around cities like Cincinnati and Columbus who might have traditionally voted Republican, who are now saying, I just can't vote for Donald Trump this time. I might vote for Republican senators and congressmen, but I'm not voting for him for president. And so now Ohio, surprisingly, is in play, when 2 months ago, people would have thought Ohio was pretty safely Trump country.
Thank you, sir. And later, I would request the other panelists also to weigh in on this particular aspect, because this is quite an interesting development about the disposition of the white urban and suburban white women, how they are looking at the Trump presidency. Thank you, sir. And may I now invite Professor Chang Chia-tong to take the floor. He's a senior researcher at the Center of American Studies in the famous Fudan University. Professor Chang, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Chair, Ambassador. So I just have a few points about this topic. So firstly, and what kind of factors affecting U.S. general election this time? You know, in last time in 2016, and the two kind of states supported Trump. Is one kind of states is in the Rust Belt, another kind of states in agriculture belts. So these kind of two kind of states put Trump go to the White House. So this time we should check same people, same states. There are people and will go to support Trump again, or Biden get some people away from Trump. It is very important. So frankly, personally, I think if according to Gallup poll on January this year, Trump's approval rate is nearly 50%, is very high for Trump. If no pandemic, Trump is very likely to be re-elected. But today very different because the pandemic issue affecting everything. So the first important issue is the pandemic and its impact on the economy. It is very important. We still have around 20 days. If U.S. economy can have some good news, specifically for stock markets, it's still very important for Trump. The second issue is a countermeasure for the pandemic, where affects rates of votes and the way of votes is very important. So, and is why Mr. Trump and Mr. Biden are talking about one issue for mail voting. Yeah, so many people mail voting is very change a lot of issues, specifically in some swing states, and very important. The third issue I want to say, I find the pandemic has intensified ideological confrontation between two parties, even between two people. You can see Biden side, they say choose Trump or choose democracy. It means Trump will fight against democracy. But Trump side say you can choose Biden or choose socialism. It means and Biden were equal to socialism. I think in the past this kind of slogan is very rare to see. But today, this year, and some very unique issue have already happened. And both parties have their own strategy for campaign. For the Republicans' campaign strategy is very clear. The number one is blame China, and second is focus on pandemic, and then continue law and order approach to the protest, and more importantly is taken Biden, and by any slogan such as Trump has labeled Biden as Sleepy Joy or extreme liberalism, this kind of label. And so I find Mr. Trump, maybe he has a strategy with our strategy. And the most important issue is not a rational strategy. Most important issue for Mr. Trump is a kind of emotional strategy. They like to manipulate emotions for the public. So it's very important. For the Democrats, Democratic campaign, they were very easy. Is say no to Trump, and in any time, any topic, specifically in the control of the pandemic, specifically on economic issue. And I found lots of people supporting Biden is sometimes because they don't like Trump. So this kind of saying no to Trump should be very useful for Biden. And the full win, I think every people want to hear answer, and I think no one can dare say. But several issues, I think, and Ambassador, you just mentioned the urban rights lady, with these kind of people. So I want to say maybe another kind of people maybe is also very, very important, such as in last election, general election, the elder white man. How about these kind of people? And these kind of people will support Biden or will support Trump continually. I think it is very important. Another part is minority, specifically for African American man. And this group, their rates of voting usually very low. And if these kind of people, their voting rates become very high, should be very different this year. I think, personally, I think these two kind of voters in the United States will decide this year's election. So how about the future? If Trump win, I think the United States will go further in the direction of unilateralism, and they will continue to play lots of forceful measures against the other countries, such as financial sanctions, export control, and other kind of forceful or coercion measures. I think these kind of measures will become new normal in U.S. policies. So this will result a very great impacts on the world, specifically on international liberal order, I think. But if Biden win, U.S. will pay more attention to multilateralism, will seek to restore relationship with traditional allies. I think U.S. diplomacy will go back to normal. I mean, and use some American way, very handsome, very powerful way to manage its relationship with other countries, including with China. So economically, if Trump, actually President Trump, his policy and externally is very tightening externally, but within the United States, and President Trump is liberalizing economy. It's very interesting. And
Dr. Chang, 1 minute.
Okay, it's very interesting. And for Biden, maybe is in opposites. Biden is opening up to other outside, but within country is very tighten up economy, specifically some management, some regulations. So, but for anyone or any party, I think next U.S. government will focus on much more on domestic issue, not international issue, and both sides, even both sides must realize lots of issues such as the supply chain, go back, many similar issues. So, but anyway, and there are many possibilities for new governments, but none of them is a return to the post-Cold War out. I mean, the American unipolar hegemony, globalization, and economic liberalism, and for United States maybe continually little bit going away from traditional policy. Well, thank you, Ambassador. I'm stopping here.
Thank you very much for your thoughtful remarks. I would later request you to build upon your comment that under Joe Biden's presidency, you expect the relations to become normal or normalize again, as you put it, in the context that there have been successive opinion polls in the US, and the 60 to 70% of the American population does not have a very favorable opinion about the relationship between the US and China. So given that fact, given the fact that the Congress, regardless of the political affiliation, has been critical. So we would love to get your perspective on how you, the grounds on which you expect that there'll be a change in the outlook under the Joe Biden presidency. But thank you very much. With that, I have the pleasure of inviting Dr. Matsumoto Asuka to give her remarks, make her remarks. She's the assistant professor in Doshisha University in Kyoto, and follows American politics very closely. Dr. Matsumoto, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and nice to meet you. So, firstly, as for who is going to win this election in August, I still thought that President Trump will win, because Mr. Biden's lead was around like 5 points in a couple of important swing states, and because they are hidden, that there are the hidden Trump supporters, and partially because some of the Trump supporters were very tired of Antifa and the lockdown. So, however, right now, if there were election tonight, he unfortunately would lose. So because he was not able to induce either like it's very bad, but stirring or like a cognitive impairment from Mr. Biden at presidential debates, and because he lost honesty from his Republican supporters like by more than 5 or 10 points. And moreover, undecided voters moved to Mr. Biden right now. So, however, as we know, like chance plays a part in election. So last 2016 election, his campaign got excited, especially right before the voting date. And now President Trump is trying to play a kind of a resurrection of Christ. So also, it's a pity for his bodyguards and others. And as for kind of the factors, like domestic and external factors that will impact the election, I just discussed domestic factors because usually like, the elections factor is very internal. However, for this election, of course, like China factor is very crucial, but also very ambivalent. The one way like President Trump got support from white male working class, pointing China as an enemy like 80s, like Japan, 80s Japan. On the other hand, Biden and the supporters, how to say, especially Biden and his members recently slightly changed his stance toward China, a little more tough stance. However, still trying to compromise with China. Like please carefully watch or read his acceptance speech. He had to say, he said like he will keep alarm on North Korea, Iran, Syria, and Afghanistan, and Venezuela, not China. And so probably the stance must be a little different. On the other hand, kind of a retaliation tariff from China was very severe against, especially Trump supporters. So this was very, how to say, different from the past trade conflicts with Japan, the USLA. So, and Biden is now trying to stop this US-China like a trade war, and it's very important to follow his, Trump supporters' mind. Actually, that they got angrier than before. And as for the impact on US foreign policy in general and the impacts on US elections with, may I choose like Japan? I talked about China already, and as for Japan, President Trump, Japanese government had very good relation, like Trump-Abe relation, and but also we need to let him understand Japanese value sharing and the evolution, the security circumstances. Right now, the President Trump is trying to increase host support nation for four times the larger. So we have paid actual cost. 85% of actual cost already, and so Japan changed its kind of a collective security role and the intelligence role. So I hope, not I, but probably Japan hope he can understand the kind of situation. And as for Biden, if as for new Biden administration, Japan needs kind of a reassurance on security. But of course, like President Obama had a couple of summit meetings with former Prime Minister Abe, and the president reassured it. So it may be fine, but still there's some worrisome. And also Biden played Reading Act on TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, but it seems very difficult for Mr. Biden to let, let's say, the try to ratify it again. So Biden left the recently achieved kind of the Biden and the U.S. Congress. No, actually Biden, sorry. The U.S. Congress recently achieved the House achieved the Democratic House were able to achieve kind of transformation of NAFTA to USMCA with inserting kind of job condition and environment requirements. So as you know, like Japan still shadow has kind of overwork and karoshi. So, and I hope Japanese society can use this pressure, gaiatsu.
Matsumoto-san, 1 minute, please. I'm sorry.
Okay, I will be in a hurry. And to our society and the KPP, some U.S. diplomats said Japan put TPP into refrigerator. So, and I hope the Biden can hatch it. And as for three, the challenges and opportunities to the new government. Right after inauguration, the crisis management is waiting, and this is the challenge. Of course, they need to handle COVID-19, and the jobless rate is more than 10%, and worse than financial crisis. So probably both said that they will, try economic stimulus. So we will see. And as for achievement Trump, as for achievements of Trump,
I would have to request you to please bring it to a close. 30 seconds.
30 seconds, okay. Thank you. As for achievement of Trump, of course, like Indo-Pacific strategy is one of his largest achievements. Originally, Prime Minister Abe had kind of the plan with only India, in 2013 or something, and but President Trump upgraded the concept. So, and the freedom of navigation is very important for Japan, whose energy sufficient rate is very low. And we are very depending on Middle East, Australia, Indonesia, and so on. So, okay. Also, eventually Japan, the U.S. was able to ratify the kind of was able to achieve the partial trade agreement peacefully. So this is probably one of
Well, thank you. I'm sorry to interject. I am always the bad boy who creates problems for the panelists. So please excuse me. Domo arigato gozaimashita. And we will again request you to take the floor. You are right that Abe-san and President Trump were the best friends. And one of the things that I would still like to know is that who actually won in the golf matches between the two leaders, because they always never announce the score, which is very smart, but one would love to understand who won in the golf rounds. But you have given us a lot of food for thought, and we'll come back to you, ma'am. Thank you very much. With this, can I invite Dr. David Mednikoff to take the floor? Dr. Mednikoff is the chair, Department of Judaic and Near Eastern Studies in University of Massachusetts, Amherst. David, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Prakash and distinguished guests. Excuse me. I'm delighted to be with you here today. I have not been fortunate enough yet to be in Nepal, so being connected virtually feels a little bit like a chance to do so. I'm a lawyer and a political scientist with specializations on the Middle East, US policy there, and international law. So what I want to do is say something general about the election, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about foreign policy and the Middle East. Let me say something a little bit different than what my co-panelists have said about the election. I asked my 18-year-old daughter, who's just starting university and is voting for the first time, what she thought I should say, because she's this important generation, and she wanted me to impress upon you why this election seems so important. So I'm going to kind of just cover a little bit of the past and then move on to some foreign policy stuff. So. The Trump presidency has been very unusual, and I think I would say destructive in at least 5 significant ways. Trump's political instincts, first of all, are authoritarian, and because of this, he's attacked or corroded many informal and formal rules that have kept the United States at least somewhat democratic and accountable to citizens and law. Secondly, he doesn't have much respect for evidence or experts. This has helped explain why the US has fallen behind on crucial issues that connect to science, whether this is global warming or our very poor handling of the coronavirus. Third, Trump isn't just divisive, he has encouraged a more active and vocal role for small numbers of right-wing Americans who have a particular agenda of repressing the rights, safety, and presence of other Americans who are non-white, Jewish, or Muslim. Fourth, Trump seems to think about US foreign policy mostly in terms of military spending. Maybe golf is also a piece of it. And he's cut funding for diplomacy and foreign aid. The fifth way in which the administration's been unusual, which I think is probably familiar to most of you, is that Trump lies and takes advantage of his office in particularly unusual financial and political ways, and ways that seem not just wrong to many, but just plain strange. Despite these unusual features of Trump's government, the US so far has managed to stay somewhat true to its recent past as a country with an increasing amount of power and wealth concentrated in a fairly small group of Americans on the one hand, but a robust culture of diversity and individual rights on the other hand. And this is because 4 important groups have resisted Trump's efforts to amass more power in his person. Those groups have been lawyers and judges, firstly. Secondly, the best established media networks. Thirdly, some members of the military and intelligence communities who have spoken up. And fourthly, ordinary citizens who have mobilized against many of Trump's actions against immigrants, minorities, or other marginalized Americans. But because of the way Trump has managed to make his party sort of the party of Trump, given that he's delivered some payoffs in areas they care about, I think a lot of people feel that if he manages to be president again after this year, the ability of others to push back on his agenda will be much decreased. Because an anti-democratic, anti-science, nationalistic, anti-immigrant US has strong implications for the rest of the world. Most people I know, like my daughter, regard this election as extremely important. So that's what I wanted to say mostly about the election. I agree, of course, with my fellow panelists on the importance of the Electoral College, the importance of the economy and COVID as the dominant issues. I think it's good that others have mentioned that there are a variety of ways that even though Biden is leading by a lot right now, Trump could still end up winning the presidency. We've heard about the Electoral College. That's important. We've heard about hidden Trump voters from Asukan. That's also, I think, very important. And then there's also this question that even if Biden wins, there's a lot of concern that Trump might not admit this, and there could be a long process of lawsuits. Again, I think Kirk talked about this. The truth is that Trump has generally not accepted typical rules of American politics, but he's also backed down on some issues when the public is against him. So honestly, I don't think any of us really knows what's going to happen next month unless the results of the election are very clear one way or another. Okay, now I want to turn to foreign policy. As already mentioned, Americans are not talking about foreign policy. They generally don't, and this election in particular, they're not. If Trump wins somehow, his anti-diplomatic nationalistic approach will no doubt continue. Should Biden win, his administration's foreign policy would be certainly to bring the U.S. back to more multilateral engagement, cooperation, and diplomacy. Unlike some of my colleagues, I'm not a Washington insider. I like Kirk, I'm out in the rural parts of the country. But I think it's pretty clear that a Democratic administration would see as its main goal taking the U.S. again back to a relatively consistent foreign policy as it's had in several decades. However, I think that a Biden administration that sees its global mission as returning U.S. policy to what it was several years ago might be misreading the country's mood and opportunity. Global challenges like climate change or increasing numbers of long-term refugees need a new sort of leadership and not merely a cautious move back to American pragmatic diplomacy, lukewarm support of international law, and corporate capitalist expansion. Where I might differ a bit from more mainstream foreign policy experts is that I think it's time for the US to come back to global affairs with a more consistent message that strong liberal democracy is distinct in the world because of its genuine commitment to international rights, non-hegemonic collaboration, and law. So I'm hoping that the split in the Democratic Party between party elites and younger members like my daughter who want the US to embody more genuine and not militaristic ideals around global problems will have an effect on making a Biden administration more innovative and principled in its foreign policy, not just kind of going back to the status quo. Let me close by saying something about the challenges and possibilities for Biden in the Middle East. The obvious prediction for Biden Middle Eastern policy would be a big balancing act between redoing a version of the JCPOA agreement that it had with Iran and Western countries on the one hand, and maintaining the stability of the increasingly collaborative and powerful triumvirate of anti-Iranian Israel, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates on the other hand. This is a difficult, thanks. This is a difficult balance, but I believe that it is likely Biden would try to de-escalate and even normalize somewhat Iran's relations to other countries in the Middle East while doing this balance. Yet a more ambitious and I believe more ultimately fruitful U.S. approach to the Middle East would be to make a major transnational effort to resolve the two fundamental, somewhat connected human issues in the region. These are the long-term status of Palestinians and the more recent tragedy of displaced victims of warfare and instability in Syria, Yemen, Iraq, and Libya. I have some ideas about addressing these issues, but I admit that neither of these major challenges, either Palestine, Israel, or Syria refugees and others, is easy. I do think that many in the world would nonetheless welcome a new U.S. administration determined to rebuild global commitment to turning disorder and dismay of Middle Eastern refugees into a more stable and humane region. I look forward to picking these up later. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David, and particularly for bring to us a two-generational perspective. Really appreciate that. You have given some excellent perspectives, and as they say, from your lips to God's ears. I mean, in this part of the world, the revival of JCPOA will be music to many ears, and that is something that I, for one, believe that it is very much required. Later, you may also want to talk about the impact of the hydrocarbon self-sufficiency that the US has now, and how has that impacted the American outlook towards the Middle East, and is that going to have a long-term impact? We already see the impact, but to what extent would that impact American foreign policy or outlook towards this part of the world? Thank you very much, sir. And now, with the greatest of joy, I would like to invite Dr. Diana Awan for her remarks. You have the last word, ma'am, and therefore it's a pleasure to offer you 8.5 minutes to share your perspective. Friend, she's a professor, communication, culture, and technology at the Georgetown University, and it's a great pleasure to invite you to address us all. Diana.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, and I'm really pleased to be here. It's kind of hard going last because so many people have already made such great points, but I'll try and give it some insights from my perspective. I study media and politics, so I thought that I would address some of the questions that we had in advance of the panel that were food for thought from that perspective. And so I want to first look at some of the factors that are impacting the election and the way they're being covered by the press, what the public is getting, what kinds of messages they're getting through the media coverage. And then I want to look briefly at the two different communication strategies of the Trump campaign and the Biden campaign. And then I would also like to have a little bit of input on the issue of where are the Trump voters going, the ones, the women, white women, but there's others that are leaving too. Some evangelicals are leaving, and even some white males with college education are starting to flee. So first, kind of taking a look at the way the media has been covering what's been happening in the election and the issues that are there. There's always, it's a lot of surprises. There's a lot of back and forth every day. It seems as if we're almost getting some sort of a new development, and some of them are, you know, kind of extreme, even, you know, bizarre. It almost seems like they're covering a perfect storm of difficult circumstances, and there's some indication from some of the research that's already being conducted and from my own anecdotal evidence of talking with friends and students that some of the public is just too upset by it and they're starting to tune out. So the news is all bad, and so they're trying to, you know, kind of limit their media diet. If we look, for example, at the coronavirus pandemic, it has had a wide-ranging implications that many of the other panelists have already said. The illness has touched many Americans, at least in some way, at least where I live, which is in Maryland. We've had a pretty heavy outbreak, and it's hard not to know somebody that hasn't had the virus or gotten sick or not survived it. And this is something that just blankets media coverage. And the fact that the president himself contracted the virus, and that the White House has been characterized by the press and by Dr. Anthony Fauci, who is one of our top infectious disease specialists, as a hotspot, a COVID hotspot, I think is really deflating, and I think really problematic for the Trump campaign. The economic hardships are illustrated quite vividly in the press, and they're getting worse day by day. And just even this past week, where there were a lot of Disney laid off thousands of workers, and other industries were laying off, having mass layoffs. Some of the images that stuck with me were of flight attendants who walked off the plane only to be handed a pink slip and told that that was going to be their last flight, and now that they were laid off. And at that very time, Donald Trump basically said that he was going to stop any talks about a stimulus bill to kind of help these people. Ultimately, he's, you know, kind of backed off of that. But these kind of contradictory messages are creating some confusion, and also, I think, not playing well with some members of the public. At the same time, we're still experiencing tremendous societal unrest. The racial divides in the country are deepening. There's few signs that it's pointing in a positive direction. And the use of deadly force by police against Black citizens and the protest against that have been on the agenda for months. What we see on the news, pretty violent scenes oftentimes, and this is juxtaposed with Donald Trump calling for a law and order platform, and Joe Biden basically countering and saying, but this is what's happening on your watch. So we're seeing, you know, that the two candidates, particularly in terms of the issues of the day, really do have kind of divergent positions. We've also seen, and it's been covered now more extensively in the press, the rise of fringe movements and private militia who are threatening the public. Just in the last couple of days, a plot to kidnap Governor Gretchen Whitmer of Michigan and take her hostage before the election and then put her on trial because of her handling of the pandemic in her state. became a subject of much media coverage. And as Governor Whitner was trying to, kind of express her anxiety and anger at this happening, President Trump, again, scoring great points with women, not really, basically trashed her personally. We've also seen the disruption of education. It's been massive. Students have had to learn virtually. People have been forced to homeschool their children or return to classrooms that are far from normal. This is depicted a lot in the press, as it should be, and it also is highlighting the disparities in access to technology and quality education that exist more generally. So all of these things that are depicted in the press, these issues, are how the public is actually experiencing the priorities in the election. And people have already mentioned the issues surrounding the election itself and the attempt to try and, kind of delegitimize the election before it happens, calling into question the ability of the post office to deliver mail-in ballots and many other things. But I want to move on within this context to look at how the candidates kind of are positioning themselves in terms of their strategy. I think the Biden campaign has been kind of clearly delineating a strategy. They have a clear message that they're trying to, kind of repeat. While I think the Trump campaign is frustrated, maybe hamstrung by the candidate himself, who's refusing to listen to his advisors and develop a coherent message. Basically, his attempt is very haphazard. It's like kind of, okay, let's see what I can do to, kind of prompt some coverage, cause some sort of a stir, and it's very short-sighted. There's no consistent message, really. They're trying to do make some, but not much. Biden, as I mentioned, is attempting to stay on message. He's been promoting a theme of national unity, bipartisanship throughout the convention. He tried to show that he was a person that you could know and trust. He tried to show his humanity. He talked a lot about his family. And this is actually, I think, resonating and showing a clear contrast with Donald Trump, who doesn't have those kinds of, that kind of empathy that Biden is able to generate. So one thing I thought I'd just briefly do is contrast the strategies of Joe Biden and Donald Trump in recent public addresses that they made just within the past few days.
In 1 minute.
Start 1 minute. Okay. So I was just going to start with Joe Biden's Gettysburg Address, where he emphasized national unity. He called the election a battle for the soul of the nation, and he never once mentioned the name of Donald Trump. He basically tried to be forward-looking. He tried to be upbeat and optimistic in a way, recognizing that we're in a really difficult time. He felt that we could all come together. He says he will represent all Americans, and he will stress bipartisan cooperation. And yesterday, Donald Trump, using the White House again as a campaign prop, which you're really not supposed to do, gathered several hundred of his supporters on the south lawn of the White House. He addressed them from the Blue Room balcony. He labeled the event a peaceful protest for law and order, but instead of addressing the nation, as others have mentioned here, he just targeted his base yet again and started, to be again, kind of throwing the face of scientists. He said that the coronavirus is going to disappear. And in the 15 minutes, basically attacked Joe Biden constantly and saying that he supports looters and rioters or whatever. So I think I'm out of time, but I was going to say that, kind of as a white suburban woman, I can understand reason why, if you look even at the debates between Donald Trump and Joe Biden and Mike Pence against Kamala Harris, women were getting pretty upset at the way that men were cutting off other people, just behaving in a way that was, kind of contrary to the way that they feel that our, kind of civil discourse should take place. There's many other things that we can talk about with his problems with women, but it's also carrying over to creating problems with evangelicals. And even yesterday, we saw that senior citizens who had been largely in Trump's camps are starting to defect.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Diana, compliments. You have touched upon certain very important points and aspects that we in this part of the world have been thinking about. And let us have one quick round of comments from the panelists before we invite questions from the floor. Now, you mentioned that Trump's support base is shrinking, and he has certainly not made any effort to expand his base. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, his support base is said to be about 40% of the populace or the voters. Now, if the support base is indeed shrinking, then would the gap between him and his opponent not be more in the opinion polls? Because I would have thought that the gap would have increased. That is one. And secondly, you mentioned economic hardship increasing. Now, despite the economic hardship increasing, all opinion polls seem to suggest that the voters, the electorate, trust him more on a handling of economic matters than Joe Biden. So there seems to be to a novice like me, there seems to be some kind of a disconnect or question marks over this aspect. Would you like to comment on that? And thereafter, I'll invite the other panelists to also comment on it. Diana, the floor is yours.
Oh, thank you. So I'll take your second question first. And I think some of this has to do with the way that polls are conducted. There's a question that would say, do you believe that this candidate handles the economy better? Versus, do you feel that you're better off now than you were a year ago? And there's big differences in the way that people are answering that question. They're basically, feel that, okay, that I'm not saying so, everyone is, but that Trump's handling of the economy is has been robust until, the coronavirus hit. But the people that are really, kind of feeling that hardship, when you ask them the question about, are you better off and how are you personally, he's not doing well. And that question has been shown, through political science research, going back decades, to show that better off, are you better off now? Do you think you'll be better off under this presidency or a different presidency? That question is often a better predictor of, the support for a candidate than the general one in terms of handling the economy. I think people see handling of the economy as something abstract from them, but when you relate it to your own personal, circumstances, it becomes something that's that becomes something that a vote can hinge on. So that's where I would see that difference. And your first question was about how his base is remaining at 40% and doesn't seem to be moving very much, and why would we not expect? Am I getting that correct?
Yes, because the base has shrunk a bit from 40.
Right.
It's 39 hypothetically. The gap in the opinion polls between him and his opponent should be more, not just about 6 to 7%.
Yeah, I think it's starting to grow more than that. The problem is that the polls are kind of, they're all over the place. And as we saw in the last campaign, they're hard to rely on. Some of them have Biden ahead by as much as 14%, and some of them by 6 or 7 or 8%. So I think it depends on what polls you're looking at too, national polls, how they're, how the polls are conducted, whether they're conducted in the states and aggregated. So I actually think in this election in particular, given all the factors that come into play, that standard polling, we're seeing a consistent, gap in favor of Biden. I think that bodes well, but the amount of that gap, I think, is pretty difficult to gauge, and that would be my way of.
Thank you. Can I invite any other panelists to comment on that?
Could I say something?
Go ahead.
On the polling, perhaps the most accurate polling is Real Clear Politics. You said 40%, but Real Clear Politics consistently says that the Trump support is about 43 to 44%.
Okay, I stand corrected.
Yeah, that has not changed a great deal. And I think that's because he's held on to the white working class vote, which had once been a Democratic vote. And it looks like a big change in US politics that's taking place is a shift of the working class to the Republicans. Who would have thought that? Typically, the party of the upper class establishment. And it could be the Democrats of becoming the party of the upper class establishment in the US. The other thing is that, you know, that Trump hasn't sought to get support from other groups. Not true. He's made, in fact, his speech that we were referring to, he made a special effort to get African Americans, Asians, and Hispanics. And all polls I've seen indicates he's going to get somewhat more than that. The big problem that Democrats have to worry about is the turnout of these three groups. Collectively, they're 30% of the US population. These three groups have traditionally not voted in high numbers.
That's
so
right.
We'll see if they do, because I think the election could depend on whether or not they come out. But I think we have to keep the perspective of who's gaining and who's losing. Right now, it seems to be a trend somewhat in the Biden direction. But then I still remember vividly 2016, when everybody was saying, in fact, if this panel had been then, oh, you know, the Democrats and Hillary Clinton are certainly going to win big for all the reasons that many of us have been saying. They proved wrong. And I think we have to be very cautious in statements that we make, particularly generalized statements, because I think the data just isn't there.
Yeah, I want to jump in on this
David,
too.
go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's really challenging for so many of us here and those of you outside is the cultural polarization, the cultural sort of bifurcation. And so, if you talk to an average group of fairly well-educated Americans, like panelists, I mean, it's sort of hard to see, how Trump could be retaining what support he retains, because, on so many issues, he seems at odds with what Americans' priorities are. But I think that what happens is that the polarization has led to this, this sort of two completely different political cultures. And it's really been alarming to see how over time party polarization has been happening. So, for example, I have an uncle who's a very fervent Trump supporter, and I was looking on his Facebook feed, and there was just all this discussion about how it's imperative to keep Biden out of the White House because, Biden is a well-known child molester. Now, we know this is false. I mean, we know, there's no evidence of this whatsoever, but in these alternative media circles, it's completely proven that, that this man is a dangerous threat. So I think it's exactly what Walter said about, and Diana too, about, sort of whose supporters are really going to show up and how strong is that going to happen? And then what difference will it make on the margins of these
That's
swings?
right.
It's so, and we just don't know. But one quick thing more is that there was a question about the Floyd Abrams, situation in Black Lives Matter. And I think that, how this kind of stuff plays out for the election is that the protests right now are mobilizing a lot of people on the Biden side. There are a lot of people that, might not vote, who I think are going to vote on the Democrat side. But then, in this kind of opposite cultural thing, this is also sort of a foil. Antifa doesn't really exist, but the threat of protests and what they represent is definitely being something that is mobilizing others. So it's very challenging. Thanks.
Kirk, go ahead. Would you also, in your 2 minutes, also touch upon, it'll just come back to me. I had a question, it was momentarily slipped my mind. Please go ahead. I'll interject to pose my question. Go ahead, please.
Okay, thank you. The comment, I think, on the base, first of all, the polling is usually a little bit behind. So just the other day, Gallup released a poll that was taken in late September that addressed specifically those two questions. Are you better off than you were 4 years ago? And who handles issues more like you? And Trump won both of those, even though he was losing in the election because people answered those questions one way, but then they were tired of him. So the polling can be a little bit behind. I think the comment Diana is making is that we're seeing, for instance, in very conservative elderly districts in Florida, the Biden golf carts, which you never would have seen before, that suggests that there are people who are traditional Trump voters from 2016 who are saying, okay, this has been a breaking point. And I agree with Walter. On one hand, he is reaching out and he says things like, I've done more for Black Americans than anybody since Abraham Lincoln. But then when there are protests in the street, he says, he basically makes fun of them by organizing his political rallies as peaceful protests, right? He basically makes fun of their lack of masks by saying, this is how we're going to get away with it. So certainly some people see he's appealing to me. And it seems like there is particularly a slice of the Hispanic electorate, which is evangelical rather than Catholic, that finds his support really important, particularly in cases like Supreme Court justices, which is why that's a huge fight right now. And and it's not really clear whether pushing the new Supreme Court justice nominee is a good thing or a bad thing for Trump. It could cut either way, but it's what his base really likes. So I think what's happening is there are many people last time who voted for Hillary Clinton, who voted against Hillary Clinton, who are now going to say, okay, Joe Biden is neutral. Hillary Clinton I always had a negative opinion of her, and they can vote for Biden even if they're not excited by him.
Sure.
And but I don't think there's anybody who voted for Hillary Clinton last time who's like, okay, now I'm going to vote for Donald Trump because I don't like Joe Biden. I think that there are some, but there are a very small slice of the electorate. I don't think that he has the ability to bring in new people. He's made the occasional effort, but one thing we can say about the Trump campaign is it's just been a year and a half of chaos. Just look at the stimulus talks. He went from, that's it, I'm done with stimulus, to 24 hours. So when are we going to negotiate a stimulus deal? And that inability to stick to a message is, I think, is also one of the things that's causing people, to come to David's point. I have an elderly relative who voted for Trump because he didn't like Hillary Clinton. And now he's saying, there's no way I can vote for him.
Yeah.
He can't quite bring himself to Biden, so I think he's going to vote Libertarian. But I do think there are more people like that than the other way around. And I think that the polls in the end will probably show that. But
thanks.
this is
Thanks.
That's
a very valid point, because there is one similarity between South Asian middle class and I'm making a sweeping statement, and the Democratic voters, they don't come out to vote. So that's a bit of a challenge. My colleagues from Japan or China, would you like to comment on that or any other aspect before I open the floor and take questions from the audience?
So may I say something?
2 minutes.
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead, please.
Okay, not on this topic, just relevant to your comments and some questions in chat room.
Yeah, sure, but 2 minutes, please. Go ahead.
Okay. So for possible new government's policy on China and which one is better. So actually, and for anyone, after the campaign, I think United States will go back to normal. The campaign time is also very hard for United States. It's not normal. So a stable United States should be much better to a stable relationship between China and the United States. Is the first point. The second point, what I mentioned, we will go back to normal. It doesn't mean we'll go back to the past. The past relationship between China and the United States will be over again and forever. So I say that this normal is a new normal. Why I like to mention normal, because the current China-United States U.S. relationship is irrational. It is very hard to sustain. So it should be changed. So I say for anyone, if Biden or Mr. Trump, even Mr. Trump, if he re-elected, he will change something. So I think a new kind of China-U.S. relationship will happen, and we are already several years competition. The third point, the normalization doesn't mean just for China-U.S. relationship. It's also for normalization of China-U.S. game model. The current game model is not good, but for a stable, moderate, sustainable game model, I think is also a kind of normalization. So just the clear points.
Thank you very much. Appreciate. Yes, Matsumoto-san, please. Take 2 minutes.
Okay. Just I'd like to make a comment, make additional comment, and I will make a kind of question. As for the BLM, some professor mentioned it. Also, probably Biden also said it doesn't exist. Of course, I'm not white, and even like when I was in DC, that I was really worried about the violence of white supremacy. And right now, Asian American now very worried about violence due to COVID-19. But still, so who broke the windows of DC right now? Or so I thought that there are two types: the violent, kind of peaceful peaceful protest by BLM and violence riot and loot by Antifa. But if it's not, if we say it's not correct, so who? And then also probably Indian people must know the kind of the importance of their non-violent violence protest by Gandhi. So majority may support BLM, but we not be able to support Antifa. So just I'm wondering. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Folks, we have exactly 10 minutes to wrap up. There are some questions which we have from the audience, and the common question or the common thread which is running through the questions is on the American foreign policy. Whether under a new administration, would the foreign policy, will we see restoration of status quo ante? Would the foreign policy again normalize? And question really also is that many countries, and especially in the Indo-Pacific region and all outside, they are a little wary now, because change in postures in the foreign policy orientation requires continuity, predictability. But if every 4 years there is going to be a change in how the Washington looks at the world, there'll be tentativeness. So what would you suggest to the to your friends in the Indo-Pacific region? What should they do? And do you see a change in the foreign policy orientation of the US? The floor, I'll request the panelists to remark, to comment on that. And each would have about 60 seconds to do that. I'm in a very generous mood, so please go right ahead.
How shall we start?
You, sir.
Okay. Will U.S. foreign policy change a lot? I don't think so. In part because U.S. foreign policy, I think, is, and for a person who worked in the Foreign Service myself for many years, as I look at how foreign policy is made, it's to a large extent governed by external events. The one issue that seems to be uppermost is China. And on China, there is remarkably little difference between the Republicans and the Democrats. Both are very critical of China, as I think Professor Song mentioned in his remarks, and I think that's true. So much depends on what China does and doesn't do. And, you know, I'd be interested in the Japanese reaction to that, but, you know, the Japanese, I think, are taking a similar view and how it interprets foreign policy. On the Middle East, it's interesting because, you know, what I see in any case, and from my colleagues at the State Department tell me that the links that have been made between the Arab states and Israel is something one couldn't have really imagined several years ago. And there may be more coming aboard depending on what stance Iran takes towards its Arab neighbors. So that's another, you know, hotspot. To be quite frank, I don't see a lot of difference between the two potential candidates. I think Biden might be willing to look and renegotiate, you know, the nuclear deal, but much depends on whether he can or not, because these are complex issues. Depends on what Iran does in its neighborhood. And if Iran is particularly assertive in its neighborhood, it's going to be very difficult to do that.
Sure. Thank you. Anybody? Any other panelists? Yes, David?
Yeah, so I have a bit of a counterpoint. So of course, I've already covered this in what I think generally in my remarks, but I do think that Trump was very different in, you know, firstly, how much he cut diplomatic efforts and funding for diplomacy. And second of all, the way in which he sort of, you know, pushed away from traditional US alliances towards kind of one-on-one relationships with leaders that he liked, which tended to be authoritarian leaders. So, you know, I agree with Walter that if Biden wins, the temptation and tendency to go back to kind of traditional US foreign policy, which was what it was before Trump. And, you know, again, kind of big kind of capitalist expansion, a lot of agreement on like what countries to kind of confront. As I've mentioned, I think the Middle East is changing. And again, I think the main point that I would want to make is that if things do go back to normal, there are a lot of pressures both between what's changed in the world and what's changing in the United States. That there may be pressures to actually change foreign policy in more dramatic ways. And I'd be very interested to see if that's possible. I mean, I know most people would think it wouldn't be likely, but there's a lot of dissatisfaction, I think, to the extent that people think about foreign policy with the status quo. So we'll see if not just the status quo under Biden, but even moving in new directions might happen. And I could say more about the Middle East, but no, there's no time. Thanks.
Yeah, but I would kind of agree with you because many of us do believe that the Trump presidency introduced a new normal. And so there is this big question whether we will continue with the new normal, or will there be a newer normal or abnormal or pre-normal? Because what Washington does have a very profound impact on the Committee of Nations. But again, I'm any other colleague, anybody wants to make a comment? Yes, Kirk, go right ahead.
Thank you. I'd be happy to I'd defer to our colleagues as well. So I think one of the really big things, I think I'm more on David's side than Walter's side, that there will be a significant change if in two reasons. One is the tone will change dramatically. I think one of the most compelling images of the Trump administration was that picture of him with Angela Merkel, where he's sitting there, like a petulant teenager, and Angela's like his mom lecturing him on the importance of alliances, which he just, the alliance is not important, it's the personal relationship. So to come back to the relationship with Prime Minister Abe, he had a good personal relationship with him. You ask about golf, my guess is that means that Abe lost to him. That's why he got along with him. If Abe had beaten him, he probably wouldn't like him. So I think the personal relationship is far more important than the history going back to the Truman Doctrine or the Wilson administration, this idea of that the United States stands for a certain set of values, whether it lives up to that or not. The other thing that I think is really important in terms of foreign policy is that Trump's foreign policy right now is being run by the B team. The people who are experts in foreign policy, a lot of them burned bridges in the 2016 election by saying that you shouldn't vote for him, and he remembered that. And then, that right now the list of foreign policy experts who are in favor of Biden is huge. So Biden's going to have a really big team of experts to choose from to create a foreign policy. Now, most of those people have been around for a long time, so they're going to go back to what they've always known, which is that period from the 1980s to the 19-teens. So I think with all respect to Walter, I think there will actually be a pretty big shift in both tone and who's running the administration. I see Walter disagrees with me, but that's my take on it. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other colleague? Yes,
Yeah,
Dr. Yes, Dr. Chang, right ahead.
Yeah, just the follow ambassador's question. So personally, I think if Biden, I think U.S. policy and approaches will be changed a lot. For why? Because President Trump, he represents a kind of transformation of U.S. relationship, U.S. viewpoint towards the world. So transformation process will be finished, may be ended. For anyone, even Trump, when transformation process finished, he must be changed. So I think U.S. policies, U.S. approach, specifically approaches to other countries, to European countries, even to China, will be changed. So it will be very important for us to understand, to see what's going on, what's coming for the United States. Yeah.
Thank you. Yes, please, Matsumoto-san, go right ahead.
Okay. May I comment on kind of continuity or change in foreign policy? Actually, I've already discussed some security field and trade field, and probably for economic and trade policy, it will continue, and probably some parts will be changed also. But on the, I'd like to add kind of energy policy and just probably relating with.
Can you speak up a little, please?
Okay, sorry.
Sorry, but I know it's very late in the night in Tokyo. Or, go ahead.
I'm fine. I'm awake. So as for energy policy, I think actually the Biden side, the energy policy is one of kind of not only internal but also kind of the foreign kind of first priority of foreign policy due to his core supporters. I mean, also relating with the Biden side, Sanders, the Bernie Sanders supporters. So actually the to how to say to negotiate about to negotiate climate change or other parts with China, the probably Biden the Biden side may change here kind of stance.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, appreciate it, Domo. We have 5 minutes. Did I see any hand from any of my colleagues? Diana, would you like to take the floor before we bring it to a close?
On this question of foreign policy, I'm not a foreign policy expert, but I think that I see it more the way that David and Kirk are viewing it. I think that the tone, the optics of foreign policy under a Biden administration would be very different than under a Trump administration. And those personal relationships, as they said, are very important. And also something that I'm kind of hoping for in terms of Biden's overall approach is that he will surround himself with people that have a lot of experience and will be able to, kind of not only in foreign policy, but kind of overall in his presidency, kind of bolster the way that we deal with domestic and international relations.
Well, thank you very much. Before I hand over the floor to my colleague from NICE, Paki, who is already has appeared in a new avatar, let me say that this has been an absolutely outstanding discussion. And all of you have been very, very supportive. Thank you. I have rarely come across panelists who have been so indulgent. So a personal thank you, and I've been enriched by the perspectives, as I'm sure the attendees today, by the perspectives that you have brought. Suffice it to say that here in South Asia, we all are eagerly awaiting the outcome of the presidential elections. And I think each one of our countries is looking forward to having closer and building further on our relationship with the US. Thank you very much. And with this, Paki, the floor is yours.
Thank you, sir. Thanks a lot. Distinguished speaker, ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the end of the session, and it is my honor to propose a vote of thanks on behalf of NICE to all those who have graced us with their presence today and contributed their part to make this event a resounding success. First things first, I would like to thank Ambassador Vishnu Prakash sir for agreeing to chair and moderate the session today. A sincere thanks also goes to all the speakers for being a part of the event and delivering such comprehensive and convincing presentations in a very short period of time provided to them. We're really honored to have you all today with us. And we would also like to acknowledge our gratitude to our friends from the diplomatic community, experts, academia, people, media, and people from different organizations as well. Finally, I must mention our deep sense of audience who participated in the webinar and those who are watching this live on our YouTube channel. Thank you for all the valuable time and attention and making this session productive with your questions. We're honored to have you all today with us. And we hope to stay connected in future as well. Special thanks to Dr. Pramod Jaiswal for organizing this session. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. God bless.